right, guys, we're here to talk about speciation. And the first I can statement is I can contrast micro and macroevolution. And the contrast is really found in the first part of the word, micro and macro. Micro means tiny, right? That's why we use a microscope to see things that are tiny. Macro means big. And so microevolution is small changes. Like this year, there's 80% purple flowers and 20% yellow. And next year, there's 60% purple and 40% yellow. Okay, it's a small change. There's nothing big. Nobody's doing anything crazy, right? Next year, it might be back to 80-20. Okay, so it's just small changes in the allele frequencies over time. And that is evolution. And what we tend to see is it swing back and forth. So it might swing more towards yellow 1 year or over 5 years, and then over the next 5 years it swings back towards purple. And that's generally what we see with microevolution. We have lots of evidence supporting this. Most people don't even call this evolution. They just say, oh, well, that's just some changes in the population. But evolution is change over time, so technically it is evolution. Macroevolution is when we talk about new species being formed. So it's when a species breaks into two new species, which we call that process speciation, and that is the hallmark of macroevolution. So that's how they're different. Micro is little tiny changes that don't create a new species. Macro is big changes that do, or a series of small changes. A lot of times, a bunch of microevolution adds up to macroevolution. All right, I can define species. So we talk about species. What is a species? A species is any group of organisms, the same organisms, that can interbreed and form viable fertile offspring. So if you take a bunch of wild boars, right, wild pigs, and they can breed with each other. You have a whole population of them running through the woods, and they can breed with each other, and their babies are strong and healthy, viable, able to survive, and their babies are fertile so that they can grow up to have babies, then you would say that all of those wild boars are in the same species. If, however, you had a wild boar that mated with a regular pig, I don't know, and they formed a hybrid, and that hybrid was either infertile or not healthy enough to survive, so it was weak and died as an infant, or maybe didn't even make it through pregnancy, died, basically a miscarriage, then you would say that that is, the hybrid is not viable or not fertile, and so they are not in the same species. So that is kind of what a species is. So when things divide, when you have one species that divides into two new species, how do we know they're two new species and not just two different populations of the original? Is because if you bring them back together and try to reproduce them, they cannot form viable fertile offspring. That's when we know they're separate species. And so that takes us to the next I can statement. I can explain what it means for a species or for species to be reproductively isolated from each other. Reproductive isolation is defined as the inability to reproduce and form viable fertile offspring. So what makes members of a population the same species? They can reproduce and form viable fertile offspring. What makes members of a population two different species is when they cannot reproduce and form viable fertile offspring. And that means they have been reproductively isolated. They're not necessarily physically isolated. They might be standing right side by side. But if they cannot reproduce and form viable fertile offspring, then they are isolated in a reproductive sense. Okay, so they cannot reproduce. So that's what it means for species to be reproductively isolated from each other. They're no longer the same species because they're reproductively isolated. Okay. I can give examples of prezygotic reproductive barriers and postzygotic reproductive barriers and talk about how those can lead to reproductive isolation. So let's look at this drawing because Miss Pira's art is fabulous. So reproductive barriers lead to reproductive isolation. So what is a barrier? A barrier is like a wall, okay? And this may be a literal wall, like physically something's in the way, or it could be a theoretical wall. It could be just some kind of issue that prevents reproduction. So when organisms cannot reproduce, there is a barrier there. Over time, so let's say we have one population and something happens and they become two populations. This population is going to evolve and this population is going to evolve, right? They're going to gather mutations, and those mutations will either become more or less common. If they become more common, let's say this has mutation number 1 and this population has mutation number 2, and both of those mutations become more common until all of these creatures have 1 and all of these have 2. If those mutations prevent these from reproducing together, then that means they're now different species. Okay? So what kind of barriers can cause that? Well, there's one type of barrier called a prezygotic barrier, and it is prezygotic because it is before the zygote. Okay, zygotes are formed at fertilization. So prezygotic means fertilization never happens. And there are 5 of these. There is physical, okay, also called geographic or habitat. There is behavioral. I hope I'm giving myself enough room to write all these 5. There is temporal. There is mechanical. Oh yeah, I can fit it in. And there is gametic. Okay. Physical is there's physically something in the way. Okay, there's a field of mice, a mountain shoots up in between them, and now half of the mice are on this side, half the mice are on this side. And so you've got, half mice here, half the mice here, and they can't get to each other to physically reproduce. Each of these populations will start to accumulate different mutations until they become so different they no longer, even if you brought them back together, they couldn't reproduce. Okay, but the barrier is physical. Behavioral. There's a mutation or something where they no longer sing the right song or do the right dance or do the right whatever that attracts their mates. And so now they don't attract the same mates. So their behavior changes. Temporal is timing. Something happens where they're not fertile at the same time anymore, okay? And so they're not reproducing at the same time so they get, you basically, and these can be still living together. So this might be, this species reproduces in the fall because of some mutation, and the original species reproduces in the spring. So now you have this kind of group within the larger group that's not reproducing, they're not reproducing together anymore because these guys are fertile in the fall and these guys are fertile in the spring. And so what you're seeing is this subpopulation will start to accumulate different mutations because they're not sharing genes anymore. There's no gene flow, even though they're living together. And so these will become a different species eventually if they accumulate enough mutations, all because these reproduce in the fall and these reproduce in the spring. Their timing is off. Mechanical, the parts don't fit. Okay, and we're not talking about sperm and egg. We're talking about the bigger parts, right? The parts that make the sperm and the egg and deliver the sperm and the egg. And so if the parts don't fit, you can't get the sperm to the egg because there's no way to deliver it there. And then gametic is where the sperm, either the sperm protein that binds to the receptor, let's see, we'll put a frowny face there. The sperm and the egg don't join together anymore because either the egg receptor had a mutation or the sperm's protein had a mutation. And so no longer will that sperm and that egg join. And so now they can't reproduce together, and so they're doing different things. So all of these are barriers that can lead to reproductive isolation. There's also, if this is fertilization, so those happen before fertilization, there's also post-zygotic barriers, meaning after the zygote. So you get a zygote, you have fertilization, but it doesn't lead to reproduction, okay? And those are hybrid inviability, or you might see it called reduced hybrid viability. Viability means able to survive. Hybrid infertility, or reduced hybrid fertility, which means they can make babies, they're healthy, but they're sterile. And then hybrid breakdown, which is where the first few generations of hybrids are fine, but as they go down the line, they get less healthy and less sterile, less fertile, more sterile. And so these, you get the zygote, fertilization happens, but then something's wrong with the baby where it's not going to continue. The mule is the good example of this one. Mules are viable, but they are infertile because a horse and a donkey are not the same species. And so horses and donkeys are reproductively isolated because they cannot reproduce and form a viable, fertile offspring. Yes, they can reproduce. Yes, they can form a viable offspring, but they cannot form a fertile offspring. And so that means they're reproductively isolated from each other, which means they are in different species. So reproductive isolation is what leads to speciation. It's the point when two species get to that point where they no longer can reproduce, they're reproductively isolated, that's when we say, that's the exact moment when we say they're now two different species. So I can give examples of prezygotic barriers, I can give examples of postzygotic barriers, I can explain how these barriers lead to reproductive isolation, okay, because basically what they're preventing is they're preventing these groups, these populations or species, from making babies that can then grow up and have their own babies, okay? And so basically what's happening is these are now going to have babies and these are going to have babies, but they're going to keep becoming more different, okay, because they're not sharing genes. And I can contrast allopatric and sympatric speciation. All right, allopatric means other country. Okay, allo means other, patric means homeland, so other country. Physical prezygotic berries would be an example of allopatric speciation. It is where a population gets separated, and so they cannot physically come back together, and they start to evolve differently based on their new environments, or the fact that they're in different environments now, until they are different species. So allopatric just simply means they are speciating. They are getting to this point of reproductive isolation, which means they're now different species, but they're doing it away from each other. And they're probably doing it because they were separated. Sympatric speciation is what we were talking about here, where one species is evolving within the other. They're still living together. Sym means together. Patric is country, so they're in the together country. They're living together. But something else is happening where there's a subpopulation that's no longer interbreeding with the big population. And so eventually they're going to accumulate different mutations. They're going to become so different they cannot interbreed. And that might be that very first mutation, right? The mutation in time here, or mutation in mechanical or gametic parts that prevents this population. And so immediately, as soon as that one mutation happens, they've been reproductively isolated and they're separate species. But it happened while all still living together. That's sympatric speciation. So I hope that helps. That's a speciation in a nutshell. But if it doesn't, or if you still have questions, let me know. Thanks, guys.